Hilchos Kilayim Perek Shvi, the laws of forbidden mixtures, chapter 7. Today we're going to be continuing to discuss Kilei HaKerem, forbidden mixtures specifically in the vineyard. Now when it comes to Kilei HaKerem, it's important to appreciate that there's two dimensions. The basic dimension of Kilei HaKerem, which the Rambam barely spends time on because it's so straightforward, is the prohibition to take a grain seed, another grain seed, and a grape seed, or a grain seed, a vegetable seed, and a grape seed, and to plant them in the ground together. When you do that, you violate the basic prohibition of Kilei HaKerem. That's super easy to understand. The second dimension of Kilei HaKerem, which is the complex one, is how do we govern planting grain or vegetables next to vines or next to a vineyard? We began to explore that yesterday. Many different laws. We discussed the trellis. You have grapes hanging over. Can you plant grain or vegetables under it? How far distance has to be created between a vineyard and grain and vegetables? And that topic is going to continue to occupy us today and tomorrow as well. For today's chapter, it's important to appreciate the difference between a vineyard and a single vine. According to halacha, when it comes to a vineyard, when you're dealing with an entity that has a bunch of vines together and they constitute a vineyard, the distance that you have to wait before you can begin planting grain or vegetables is greater. If you're only dealing with a single vine, the distance is smaller. And the complexity begins in defining what makes a vineyard and what makes a single vine. As we're going to see, you can have a case where you're going to have many vines, but they're going to be treated halachically as a single vine. Sometimes you can have a single vine, and it'll carry the halachic significance of a vineyard, and greater distance will be required. That's what we're going to be getting into today. So the Rambam begins with the basics. Halacha Aleph, habali is rea betzad hakerem. If somebody comes to plant grain or vegetables on the side of a vineyard, the basic halacha is marchik mimenu arba amos meikre agfanim mizerea. One is required to distance 4 amas of distance, about 6 feet, from the base of the vines, and you can begin to plant. As you have in the picture, there's the vineyard. You wait 4 amas, begin to plant the wheat. But if it's a single vine you're dealing with, the distance required is much smaller. You only have to distance 6 handbreadths, and then you could already begin to plant your grain or your vegetables. But then we get into the details. You can have 1 row of vines, one next to the other, even 100 vines. It's just 1 long row, it's not a vineyard. So 1 row of vines stretching down, even if it's 100 vines, according to halacha, it doesn't have the status of a vineyard. Each vine is considered like a single vine, and all you have to do is create a distance of 6 handbreadths from the vine, from the row, and you can already plant grain or vegetables. But the moment they become 2 rows, now they're a vineyard. And from either side, wherever you want to plant the grain or the vegetables, you have to now distance yourself 4 full amas. And only then can you plant the grain or the vegetables. So if we walk out of this halacha, we now have a basic working definition of what's a vineyard. 2 rows of vines, vineyard, single row of vines, not a vineyard. However, it gets more complicated than that. First of all, how long do the rows have to be? Second of all, how spaced out can the vines be from each other? That's halacha base. First, the Rambam addresses how long the rows have to be. Telling me 2 rows is a vineyard. Fine. How many vines have to be in each row? Again, the basic rule is 3 vines. So you have to have 2 rows of 3 vines, basically a rectangle of 6 vines. That constitutes a vineyard. However, when do they constitute a vineyard if they're spaced correctly? If the space between each individual vine is anywhere between 4 amas to 8 amas. Typically, grapevines were spaced at 4 amma intervals, but we're going to give you a grace space of up to 8 amas. As long as the distance between the individual 6 vines that we're talking about, if we're going with the minimum, 2 rows of 6 vines. If the vines are spaced from each other at a distance of anywhere between 4 and 8, then they get classified as a vineyard. But let's say the vines were spaced so far apart that between each individual vine, not including the space that the vines occupy themselves, the space between the vines, if there was 8 amas or more, now these vines are considered separate units from each other. They can't combine to create one entity called a vineyard. And therefore, you treat each vine as an individual vine. And you're only going to be required to distance yourself 6 handbreadths from each row. Similarly, if they were 2 jumbled together, they don't even have 4 amas of space in between the vines. They all become like one single vine. And you're only required to make a distance of 6 handbreadths to each direction before you begin planting your grain or your vegetables. So now, emerging from halacha beis, we have 2 definitions to create a vineyard. First of all, it has to be 2 rows of vines. In those 2 rows, there have to be at least 3 vines. But the vines have to be spaced out enough, but not too far, to be considered one cohesive unit. Now says the Rambam, let's take that a step further. Hayu shalei shuris. Let's say you weren't going with the minimum. You had more. You had 3 rows. 3 rows of vines. We just said that if the 2 rows of vines are too close together, they only count as 1 row. What if you have 3 rows and they're very squished together? Even though between each row is less than 4 amas of space, they do become a vineyard. Why? Because we only pay attention to the 2 outer rows. The 2 outer rows, in a case where 3 rows are jumbled close together, that means that the 2 outer rows are spaced at the interval that normally 2 rows would be spaced. So we just treat the middle ones as if they don't exist. Delete that line. How much space is there between the first and the 3rd row? Probably somewhere between 4 and 8 amas. And therefore those 2 rows combine to become a proper halachic vineyard. Similarly, if we go the opposite way, you had 3 rows. Again, you weren't going with the minimum, but they were so far apart that between each individual row there was a full 8 amas or more. Each row is treated individually. They don't combine because they're too far apart, and you can actually end up planting grain or vegetables in between the rows. Because you only require 6 tfachim this way, 6 tfachim that way. 6 tfachim is an amma, as we're going to see in tomorrow's chapter. So you're basically going an amma away from this one, an amma away from that one. And if you have 8 ammas of space between, you now have 6 ammas, which is about, almost 9 feet of space to plant in between. That's how important creating this cohesive entity is. Once you have a cohesive entity of vineyards, you got to wait 4 ammas outside of the vineyard. But if the rows themselves can't form a single entity, you can even end up interrupting the space between them by planting grain or vegetables because you only treat them as individual vines from which you only have to distance yourself 6 tvachim, 6 handbreadths. Halacha daled lefichach, therefore, taking all of this into account, haneteyas karme mitchila, a person who plants his vineyard at the outset, v'hirchik ben kol shura v'shura shmayna ames, and he makes a distance between each row of 8 amas or more, mutar lahavi zera besoiche, as an initial preference, you can bring grain or vegetables, plants into that vineyard. Umarchik mikol shura shisha tvachim mulvad, and simply distance from each row 6 tvachim, 6 handbreadths. Avalim zara chutzaloi. However, if you want to plant outside of that vineyard, tzarich laharchik mishura hachitzoina arba amas keshara kramim. The Rambam throws in a wrench. In this case, you will have to distance yourself from the outermost row 4 amas like any other vineyard. Why? Because here you planted the vineyard like this to begin with. You plan to make it so spaced out. So yes, in between the rows, we're going to treat them, since there's so much space, as individual vines, but as a whole, you planted this as a whole vineyard. And therefore on the outside, you have to wait the requisite 4 amas. The law of this vineyard, the one where you purposely spaced them out at 8 amas, the law pertaining to between the rows is not the same as the law that we're going to learn soon of a vineyard which is destroyed in its midst. There's a clearing created. Some of the vines dry up or are uprooted. Where over there's a different set of laws, a more stringent set of laws. And the reason we're lenient here is because at the outset you planted them with this spacing. Since at the outset you planted them with this spacing, we're more lenient and we allow you to bring grain and vegetables into the area between the rows. As we're going to see, if you have a vineyard, regularly spaced vineyard, and part of it is destroyed in the middle, then we're going to treat it more stringently. Halacha hey, haisa besada zu shura achas shel gefanim, ubizdei chaveirei shura achas kenegda krevala. You have in your field only 1 row of vines. Your friend, next door neighbor, also has 1 row of vines. So here's 1 row, here's a second row, they belong to 2 different people. Even if in between there's a pathway, used by a private individual or by a public individual, they're different sizes. Derech HaYachid is only 4 amas, Derech Harabim is 16 amas wide. Or a fence, but it's a low fence, less than 10 handbreadths. They actually both combine together and they become one cohesive unit called the halachic vineyard. Again, there has to be less than 8 amas of space. The moment there's more amas of space, They're considered two separate entities. This creates a little bit of a problem. As I said before, derech harabim usually is 16 amas wide. So if there's a derech harabim, by definition, there's more than 8 amas. So some people say over here that derech harabim has to be interpreted as a smaller pathway used by the public. The point that Rambam is making, nevertheless, is that these two vines, these two rows of vines, even though they belong to two separate people, can combine to become a vineyard if the proper space is between them. And then, if you want to plant grain or vegetables on the other side, you'll have to go a full 4 amas away like you would from a regular vineyard. Halacha vav, nata shura achas ba'aretz, v'shura achas b'madrega. A person plants a row of vines on the ground and another row of vines on top of, or on the slope of, a hill. We had this concept yesterday a little bit with vines and other plants. Here it's all vines, okay? So we want to know, can this row of vines and this row of vines connect to become 2 rows and therefore become a vineyard, requiring you to go 4 amas away over here if you want to plant grain or vegetables? Says the Rambam, it depends how high. If this terrace, this embankment, is 10 tfachim, 10 handbreadths higher than the ground level, einam mitzdarfin, and the row over here and the row over here do not combine. Paches mikein mitzdarfin, but if the space between them is less than 10 tfachim, then they do combine. They do combine in the sense that now they become 2 rows and 1 big vineyard. If you read the Rambam literally, the Rambam is not talking about where the vines are. So this picture is a little bit inaccurate. He's talking about the actual height of this terrace. If the height of this terrace is 10 tfachim above the ground level, then, and as some commentaries understand it, any vines that you plant, even on the slope as you're going down, are considered separate from the ones on ground level. But if the embankment is less than 10 tfachim away from the ground level, then all rows of vines combine. Halacha Zayin, so we've said in the beginning of the chapter that the 2 rows that constitute a vineyard have to each have at least 3 vines. That means you're going to have a total of 6 vines. What if somebody wanted to get away with a little less than that? Hanetea chamish gefanim, a person plants only 5 vines, shtayim keneged shtayim va'achas yetzezanav, 2 opposite 2, and one of them emerging as a tail behind them, as the picture is over here. Hareza nikra kerem katan, says the Rambam, according to halacha, we actually call this a miniature vineyard. And you'll be required to distance yourself 4 amas from each side. In other words, ideally it should be 6, but if it's 5 and this is how you planted them, they become one entity and you have to treat it as a vineyard. But if you did 2 against 2, and one of them was in the middle, one of them in the middle means like the 5 on a dice. So you have 2 on this side, 2 on this side, and 1 is smack in the middle. Or 3. And then 2 at the 2 top corners. The 5th one, in other words, not emerging as a tail. It's simply kind of jumbled in between somewhere. Einam kerem. These 5 vines don't become a vineyard. You treat them all as individual vines, and you only have to distance yourself 6 tfachim, 6 handbreadths, before you can begin planting grain or vegetables. Halacha ches kerem shecharav. You have a vineyard that was destroyed somewhat. It used to be full of vines. Now there's only a couple left. Im yesh bei lelaket. Eser gefanim l'chol beis sa'ah. Beis sa'ah means an area where you would usually plant a sa'ah of grain. It's defined as 50 amas by 50 amas. 50 square, an area of 50 amas by 50 amas. If in this area you can find 10 vines, v'yiyu netuais, shtayim keneged shtayim v'achas yetzazanav, and they'll be planted in that formation of 2, and 1 coming out as a tail. If you notice closely, this looks like one big jumble, but look here. You have 2 and 2, and 1 as a tail. Or 2 and 2, and this one as a tail. That's how most people understand the Rambam. You only have to have 5 out of the 10 organized in this fashion. Some understand, as emerges from the Talmud, the Yerushalmi, which is the source of the Rambam, they have to actually have all 10 configured in this way. 2 sets of 5, 2 and 2, and a tail. But the point is, if at least you can find 5 in this formation, or somewhere you have a full Torah vineyard, 3 next to 3. We call this vineyard a poor vineyard. And the entirety of this space becomes considered a halachic vineyard. Since it began as a vineyard, it was simply destroyed. The whole space still retains its status as a vineyard, and you have to go 4 amas away from the borders of the field before you can begin planting grain or vegetables. It's forbidden to plant in the Entirety of the space. What What if this mixture emerged not as a result of a regular vineyard which got destroyed, but that's how you planted it to begin with? You were a little chaotic in your planting. You didn't plant it in even rows, you planted it all over the place. So again, you got to look around and you see. If you can find 2 against 3, and here the Rambam uses the word 2 against 3. So the commentaries say it means like this formation. 2 and then 3. A full 3, not one coming out as a tail. Then harei ze kerem. Then it's a vineyard. If not, it's not a vineyard. It's enough if you'll distance yourself 6 handbreadths from each vine and you plant. There's much discussion in the commentaries why this case of the chaotic vineyard is a little different to the previous case of the poor vineyard. We're going to leave it for now. As we say, you offer the wise man some things to look into, and they'll look into it themselves and become wiser on their own. The guy, he wasn't chaotic. He planted all the rows and all the vines in aligned, even rows. So the bases of all the vines were aligned. But the leaves, as they began to grow, didn't grow in an aligned fashion. That's going to happen many times. Since the bases of the vines are aligned, it's a halachic vineyard. But if only the leaves were aligned and not the bases, then it's not a vineyard because they weren't planted in a proper way. What if the formation was such that the bases of the vine were very thin? So the thin vines relative to each other were not in an even row. But if you were to make them thicker, if you could imagine them as thicker circles, then all the vines would align. In other words, there were thin bases, not aligned. If you thicken them, then they are aligned. Then it's considered a vineyard. How will you figure that out if they're aligned in their thicker imaginary state? Take a tape measure, take a string, stretch it out from one to the other, and figure out if at this distance, if they would become thicker, would they all become aligned? You have a vineyard that got destroyed in its middle. There was a clearing created in the middle, but it's complete on all other sides. This is the situation that Rambam was referring to earlier when he was comparing this to the case of the vines that were spaced out with greater than 8 amas of space in between the vines to begin with. So you have a vineyard that was destroyed in the middle. If the karachas means bald spot, if the empty spot that was created in the middle is 16 amas by 16 amas, then you can distance yourself from the base of the vines on the inside of the clearing, 4 amas to each side, treat it as a regular vineyard, and you can plant in whatever space remains in the midst of that bald spot. But if the clearing is not 16 amas big, treat it as a full vineyard and don't bring any grain or vegetables in there. If you did, if at least you kept the distance of 4 amas from the base of every vine in that vineyard, then you haven't created a forbidden substance, and the grain or the vegetables which you plant after the fact are not going to be forbidden. Also, the many times there's an empty space that remains without any vines between the edge of the vineyard and the wall surrounding the vineyard. So here's just a picture that I made for imaginary understanding. Here's the vineyard, there's the wall. Okay, imagine it's a bird's eye view. So this area between the edge of the vineyard and the wall, v'hu hanikra mechoil hakerem, says the Rambam, it's called mechoil, the walkway, the passageway of the vineyard. In yesh by shtei mesrei amma, if the total space of this passageway is 12 amas, marchik min agfanim arba amas v'zeireya es hashar, then you can distance yourself 4 amas over here from the vineyard. It's called the work area. I never actually clarified why you have to distance yourself 4 amas. The Rambam doesn't say why, but the commentaries in the Talmud explains why. It's because we want to have some free area to be able to work the vines. Kedei avodah it's called in the Talmud. So you leave 4 amas of space from the vineyard for the work area. V'zeireya es hashar, and you can plant the rest. Here's what's called the farmable area in the middle. You have to leave some space on the other side as a passageway, but you can definitely plant the area in the middle. If the total area of this passageway was less than 12 amas, no bringing any plants there at all. If you did, if you left the 4 amma distance from the vineyards, we're not going to hold you accountable. You didn't make it forbidden. When do we say we have this passageway on the side, and if it's big enough you can bring vegetables or grains there? Only if it's a large vineyard. Aval bekatan, but if it's a small vineyard to begin with, ein loy machar, that doesn't have the halachic status of a passageway, even if there's clear space between the vineyard and the wall, we don't give it that special treatment. You simply create the space of 4 amos from the edge of the vineyard and plant whatever space remains until the fence, until the wall. Or if you had a large vineyard, which you spaced out in great measure, 8 amos or more between each vine, it doesn't have the special law of the passageway. You simply go 4 amos away from the vineyard and plant the rest. What if in this scenario the wall that was surrounding the vineyard was less than 10 tfachim high, which is the usual requirement to create a separate domain? Where it was 10 tfachim high, but it wasn't 4 tfachim wide. 4 tfachim wide is also part of the general fundamental element that creates a separate domain, as we learned at length in the laws of Shabbat. Since the wall isn't big enough, it doesn't have the special law of the passageway. Again, distance yourself 4 amos from the vineyard, plant whatever space remains. Even if it's exactly a very small amount of space, you have 4.5 amos from the end of the vineyard to the wall. You can plant that half amma that remains, but next to the wall, you can plant it. If you have a fence that's 10 tfachim tall, or you have a ditch that's 10 tfachim deep and 4 tfachim wide, we had this alluded to in an earlier chapter. Once you have a wall in between 2 areas, you can literally bring 2 separate things up to the wall on both sides. You can plant a vineyard on this side, here I have the picture. Vineyard on this side, and wheat right next to it, literally up to the wall. Even if the wall in between is made up of reeds, if between each individual reed there was not 3 tfachim of space. This is the principle of lavud. Lavud means attached. According to the Torah, if you have less than 3 handbreadths of space between 2 entities, they become like one. So you have a bunch of individual reeds. You can literally see from one side to the other, but if there's less than 3 handbreadths of space between each reed, it becomes like one big wall. It divides, like a fence, between the vineyard and the vegetables, and you can literally plant both on both sides up until the wall. What if you have this fence that's dividing between a vineyard and vegetables, and then it breaks? There's a breach in the wall. If the breach is anywhere up to 10 amos of space, about 15 feet, it's just considered an opening or a doorway through the wall, and it's allowed. Once the breach is larger than 10 amas, any grain or vegetables planted opposite that space of the breach is forbidden to be planted there unless it's 4 amas distanced from the grapes. Nifritzu by pratzis rabbis, if multiple breaches were opened in the wall. If the remaining standing wall was equal to the space created by the breaches, it's permitted as though there's no breach at all. Once the breach space exceeds the space of the regular standing wall, each breach you have to check that you're distancing 4 amas away from the grapes before you begin planting the grain or the vegetables. Let's say there's a neighbor. Okay, this is not the same person. One person owns the wheat field, one person owns the vineyard. And there's a fence between them which is allowing them to plant all the way up to the wall. Then this divider breaks. We tell the Jew who owns it, you got to put it back up. If he put it back up and it broke again, we tell him put it up again. The moment he, so to speak, despairs, or it becomes clear his intention, he's not planning to put it back up again, that's the moment that he makes the other entity forbidden. Now, I should say then, that maybe I misspoke when I said it was an issue of a neighbor. It could be it's his own field. The point is that you only make the other entity forbidden if we've told you to put up the wall and you clearly are not going to. Forgive this little primitive art over here. You have a room that's half roofed and half not. Vines are planted under the one side, let's say under the roof. You can plant vegetables or wheat or other things on the other side. We have a principle in halacha. At the edge of a roof, is considered to become a divider. The fact that only half of the space is roofed makes as though there's a divider coming down at that point, dividing between the grapes and the grain or the vegetables. Once you even out the roof, you make it extend on the full space. Now if there's grapes here and grain or vegetables here, that's a problem. You have two courtyards that are adjacent to each other. They used to have a wall over here, now this wall broke. So the smaller courtyard just opened fully into the larger courtyard. There were vines in the larger courtyard. It's forbidden to plant grain or vegetables in the small courtyard. The small courtyard is considered to be an extension of the larger one. It's all part of the vineyard. If you plant, the plants become forbidden. The grapes remain permitted. For the grapes, we'll say it's a separate entity. But for the plants, we'll say, no, you're a continuum of the vineyard. If the flip side was true, the grapes were originally planted in the smaller courtyard. You could plant other plants in the larger courtyard. Since they're relative to the space of the larger courtyard, there are these little protrusions that are coming out on these two sides. It's considered separate from the smaller courtyard. Whereas the small courtyard cannot claim to be separate from the larger one. The smaller one is an extension of the larger one. But for the larger one, we say, hey, we're closed off to you. So even if there's grapes back there, we're going to plant our own stuff over here. If there's a ditch running through a vineyard, 10 tfachim deep, 4 tfachim wide. It's considered a divider. And on a certain level, it's going to separate those two rows that are next to it. It says that if it was open all the way from the beginning of the vineyard till the end, it's treated as a space between two vineyards, and you can plant in it. Provided, of course, that the vines growing over here don't extend over the ditch. As we explained in yesterday's chapter, that once you have vines over, you can't plant grains under. But if the ditch didn't run all the way through the vineyard, it's like a little press or a little pit in the middle of a vineyard. Even if it's 10 tfachim deep or 4 tfachim wide or more, you cannot plant inside it anything else, unless the full clearing created by the space was 16 amas, in which case it's exactly compared to the case we had before of the destroyed vineyard. So imagine this wasn't a destruction, this was just simply a pit. Then if it's 16 amas wide and 16 amas long, you can plant other stuff in there. Halacha chaf aleph, shvil shebein shnei akramin. A pathway running between two vineyards. Vineyard on this side, vineyard on that side, pathway running through. It's considered like a vineyard that was destroyed in the middle. If the total space of this is 16 amas, distance yourself 4 amas from here, 4 amas from there, plant the rest with grain or vegetables. But if the total area of the clearing, the pathway, was less than 16 amas, no bringing any foreign grains or vegetables into that space. Shemeda literally means guardhouse, but as the Rambam understands it in his commentary to the Mishnah, it's like a mound of earth that was in a vineyard, which could be used as a lookout point. Somebody could stand on it and kind of guard the vineyard from there. If that mound is 10 tfachim tall, 4 tfachim wide, it becomes its own domain. You can plant on the top of it vegetables. It's not part of the vineyard. So long as the leaves of the vine don't touch it. And touch it, many understand the Rambam's interpretation here, is that the vines shouldn't be touching any part of the mound. So here, the picture I made it, very, very distant. But imagine there was literally vines growing all around this mound. If the vines are beginning to train onto the mound, then it's already forbidden. So it shouldn't seem from a top view, a bird's eye view, that you have vegetables in a vineyard. When do we say this? If the lookout mound is totally square. But if the lookout mound was round, it's not enough that the total width of it is 4 tfachim. In other words, it's not enough that its diameter is 4 handbreadths. You have to be able to draw a square of 4 by 4 tfachim inside it, so that you'll be able to establish a separation of entity from the ground. Plus, it needs to have an area of loose earth. The top 3 tfachim have to be loose earth. They can't be tough earth in order to allow for this permissibility. Chav Gimel, habayis shebakerem, if you have a home or a house in the middle of a vineyard. If it was anywhere between 3 tfachim by 3 tfachim until 4 tfachim, you can plant in the house, it becomes its own entity, you can plant vegetables there. But if it was less, a very tiny home, it's not what they call a home, maybe a room, less than 3 handbreadths by 3 handbreadths, it's considered shut off, sealed off. You can't plant anything in there, it just becomes part of the vineyard. A single vine is planted inside a ditch. So let's just say we can imagine this ditch over here, running through the vineyard, and maybe there was a vine planted in that ditch. Distance, 6 tfachim of distance from the vine, and plant other things in the ditch, as you would do on plain flat land. But if it was 10 tfachim deep, and the width of the edges of the ditches were 4 tfachim at the top, once you have a vine in that ditch, you cannot plant other things in the ditch, even if you go 6 tfachim, 6 handbreadths away from it. It assumes its own identity almost as a vineyard, and you can't plant other things in its region. You had a single vine growing in a fence, enclosed in an area that was 10 tfachim tall, 4 tfachim wide. You should not plant in the entirety of this area, even if you went 6 tfachim away, because by putting this one vine, here's the example of what I mentioned before, you have one vine almost treated like a vineyard. Since you have one vine, and you purposely enclose the area, you're giving it a certain level of importance. Since in the end of the day it's a single vine, if you did only distance 6 tfachim and already plant, you haven't made it forbidden. However, how much should you distance yourself to begin with in the initial preference before you plant grain or vegetables in that enclosed area? 4 full amas to every direction. And only then go ahead and plant the rest of the ditch or the rest of this area that's enclosed by a fence. Why? Because if you put one individual vine and it's clearly enclosed, then you're giving it that importance of kind of owning this entire space. It becomes like a vineyard. Only when you go 4 amas away do you have the permissibility to plant, again, other grain or other vegetables.